Good morning and welcome to Sevilla. Time to time, it is good to look back and see where we come from. 10 years ago, in season 2008-2009, California had what at that time was the largest crop in history of 1.6 billion pounds in the middle of a severe global economic downturn, the credit crisis, the stock market fluctuations, the escalating Middle East conflict, and a new US administration. Prices, of course, were down, and California finally shipped 1 billion pounds of almonds. 10 years later, in season 2017-2018, California have had a record crop of 225 billion pounds, 40% up from 10 years ago. And we are projecting to ship 2.3 billion pounds, 65% up from 10 years ago. The global economy is in a much better shape, and we can be really optimistic about the future of our industry. But at the same time, we have a great responsibility to preserve everything we have built. I am Joan Fortuny, the Operation Managing Director at Borges Agricultural and Industrial Nuts, and I will lead today's Almond Roundtable. First of all, let me introduce my colleagues today at the Almond Roundtable. From your left to your right. Richard Waycott, President and CEO of the Almond Board of California. Next to Richard is Mark Jansen, the President and CEO of Blue Diamond Growers, the world's largest almond processing and marketing company. Next to Mark is Raju Bhatia, the founder and managing partner of California Agri-Nuts Corporation, one of the largest importers of almonds, pistachios, walnuts in India. Next to Raju is Brenton Wollstone, Managing Director of Almond Co. Australia. Brenton is also the Director of the Almond Board of Australia. And finally, Antonio Pons Jr., President and CEO of Crisol de Frutos Secos, the largest nut grower organization in Spain dedicated to almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, pistachios, and carrots. Now, time for the official almond chart. As you can see, for California crop, we are using the subjective estimate of 2.3 billion pounds and a carry-in of 325 million pounds. For Australia, we are considering a crop of 78,000 metric tons, 3% down from previous year. For Spain, we are considering a crop of 60,000 metric tons, 13% up from previous year. As you can see, total supply will be almost the same than previous year. But behind those numbers, there are many things to say. Time to talk about California's crop. We had freeze and cold temperatures in late February. The acreage estimate is 7% up versus prior year. There are 125,000 acres of third-leaf trees, technically non-bearing. And we have seen in the last couple of weeks several different estimates ranging from 2.2 billion to 2.5 billion pounds, with the subjective at 2.3. And for the objective, we'll have to wait till July 5th. Such differences can have a great impact in the market psychology. Mark, please give us your view of the situation.
What you should know is that it's been 5 years since we've seen the full potential of the California almond crop. And if you consider that a year ago, we went through what we thought was the worst bloom weather on record. Rain, poor conditions for pollination. And we followed it up this year with freezes that I know there are almond growers in the audience from Blue Diamond that tell me that they've been farming since 1970 and haven't seen this bad or widespread of a freeze. In fact, UC Davis would suggest that we shouldn't have an almond crop this year. But what appears to have happened was that the stage of bloom makes a big difference. And we were early in the bloom cycle in many cases. And those varieties that were still at pink tip or bud or early in the bloom cycle tended to survive relatively well through this unusually cold period. And I think we found that expectations for the crop have gradually increased. And I'll give you my official forecast today. My forecast would be this, that if you look at the acreage for almonds, we have currently previous year was 1 billion acres of bearing almonds. Forecast officially for the summer will be 1.07. I think the reality is most people know that it's underreported. It's probably closer to 1.1 billion acres that are bearing. And if you take last year's yield levels, you forecast that together and you get a forecast of 2.365 billion. That's somewhere in the middle range, I admit, of the forecasts that have come out thus far, but think it's a very good estimate of what we're likely to see from California this year. A good crop, it'll be a record crop, but is a crop that, similar to this year, will actually lead us to an outcome that has almonds running short in supply. I'll jump forward quickly and say that if you look at the chart behind me, that the ending stock is forecasted at 325 million pounds. That ending stock is not enough to carry us over into the new crop. We've been bouncing around 400 million pounds. 8 weeks of supply we thought was as low as we could get. Well, that 325, that's somewhere in the range of 6.7. And on top of this, we had unusually high insect pressure in this crop. So we think that there are more rejects and bad product than typical. So the real supply may be closer to 300 million pounds. If you fast forward to that 2.365 and assume just moderate growth of 4%, and I'm sure we'll talk later about the levels of growth, but at a very modest 4% rate of growth in the almond demand, we're looking at carryouts next year, which are even lower than that 325 level of carryout. So we're seeing probably the summer shortages in certain varieties of almonds. I believe we'll repeat that again next year, that not only will we sell this crop, but we will have a demand that exceeds the supply.
Thanks, Mark. We move now to Australia. Brenton, the 2018 Australian almond crop will be around 78,000 metric tons, down from 2017 crop of 81,000 tons and 2016 crop of 82,000 metric tons. What factors have affected negatively the 2018 crop?
Thank you. The Australian crop is underperforming compared to where we should be. This year is a classic example of the industry's harvested a lot more acres for less production. And that's basically two things. Firstly, poor weather during pollination. The Australian crop is 50% non-Purell and 30% Carmel variety. So the weather timing between non-Purell and Carmel is very important to the Australian crop, and this year the pollinisation wasn't ideal, but the crop potential was still pretty good for the 2018 crop. Unfortunately, after pollination, when the almonds were just beyond the nutlet stage, there was 3 major frost events in 2 major growing areas, which represents 80% of the Australian production. That's in New South Wales and also in Victoria in Australia. So that sort of knocked our potential down from, we should be closer to 90,000 metric tonnes of almond kernels, but here we got the worst crop in 4 years at 78,000 tonnes, and the almonds are still being reseeded in the system. I was talking to Mark and Richard earlier. The frost is very visible at the time of the frost, and the almonds are bought shortly after the frost. So you can see the impact of that on the orchard floor. But what we're seeing is, as the almonds have come in, particularly the non-pearl variety, that the fruit is coming in, but there's actually no edible kernel in the almond. And so far for us, that's representing another 4% in loss. So don't be surprised that the 78,000 tonnes for Australia may be lower.
Thanks. Brenton, it looks like the bearing acreage will increase significantly in coming years. What are your projections and how do you see the pace of new almond plantings in coming years?
Certainly, there's currently we have about 70,000 acres in full production and about another 20,000 acres that have been harvested, for the first and second harvest. So, and then there's been an additional 20,000 acres planted in the last 2 years alone. So there's certainly been a significant expansion in the Australian almond industry, which will get our crop in the early 2021, 22 to over 100,000 tonnes, probably 110,000 metric tonnes.
Okay, thank you. Now time for Spain. In Spain, after a period of drought in the main production areas, we had record rains in February, March, with certain areas recording more than 10 inches of rain. No significant damage of frost freeze during the almond blooming, but cooling temperatures probably have delayed the crop at least 1 or 2 weeks. Like in California, there are plenty of different estimations of the almond crop, ranging from 60,000 metric tons to 85,000 metric tons. It is really difficult to estimate the Spanish almond crop with plenty of new third and fourth leaf almond plantings entering in production and a significant increase of new almond plantings under drip irrigation conditions in the last 5 years. Anyhow, it looks like the Spanish production of almonds is facing a revolution. Antonio, please explain the great changes that the Spanish almond production is going through.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, colleagues. In Spain, we are having a very nice, good opportunity. Let's say good news. No? The growers, the almond growers in Spain have changed substantially what is for them growing almonds. In the past, almond trees were in the worst areas, in the worst margins, and the low yields. Right now, almonds in the past, let's say 5-10 years, has become more productive and more understanding for the majority of the new farmers. This is what is going to bring Spain as a very much bigger producer of almonds and trying to supply what our colleagues from Australia and US cannot give us. So maybe we will try to help a little bit. As you said, Joan, right now we consider that Spain is around bearing irrigated acres around to 50,000-60,000 hectares. But it's planned that in the next 4 or 5 years, we are going to arrive to certain 100,000 new hectares, which is going to provide approximately 20% of the Spanish surface. This means that in terms of production, in the next 4 or 5 years, we are going to experience the same trend that happened in Australia, in California, years ago. So probably in 5 years, our production is going to be 4 times what it was 20 years ago.
Thank you, Antonio. Water and production costs are 2 key factors to consider in the medium-long term. Richard, please give us an update in regards with the water situation in California for the short and medium term, especially in relation with the new State Groundwater Management Act that will begin setting severe limits on groundwater pumping as soon as 2020.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. I think there are a couple of perspectives in which to look at production costs. One is sort of the historical reference. Often we reflect in California that over the last 20, 25 years, the cost of production's about tripled from where it was. I think most growers now are at $3,500 to $4,000 an acre, and that was about a third of that 20 years ago. Also, land prices have basically tripled as well over that same period. So we've had that type of appreciation in cost. And the question is, well, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? So are we looking at $8,000 an acre in cost 20 years from now? So I think we have to appreciate that the industry, for the most part, has mitigated that increase in cost by higher productivity. So yields have grown in addition to increased costs, and we've been able to produce more with each acre that we planted, and that's helped to keep the cost per kilo from increasing as rapidly as overall costs have increased. So that's been a good strategy, but again, the question is, over the next 20 years, what kind of productivity increments are possible? I think specifically to California, we are faced with some historic changes in our cost structures, and a couple of those are the water situation. For the first time in our history, we will be regulating groundwater, and that is going to be a tremendous game changer for a lot of growers that rely entirely or primarily on groundwater. There will be regulatory protocols put into effect of how much water can be extracted in each one of our production areas, and that will affect those that don't have as much access to groundwater as they would like. The other is labor. We have a state that's very progressive, if you will. We have a minimum wage which is increasing by $1 a year over the next few years. We'll get up to $15 per hour by the year 2022. And we also have eliminated the exemption for overtime for agricultural workers. So any worker that works over 8 hours now will have to pay overtime. Now, I know the Australians would love to have $15 an hour in terms of their labor rates, but for us it's certainly increasing. And then, as you may all follow a little bit, the immigration situation. So farm labor in the United States is just caught up in so much politics that we can't sort of solve our problem, and we do need immigrant labor to help our crop harvesting, not only in almonds but in other crops across the state. So just a couple other things affecting the situation would be, obviously the price of petroleum is now gone up, and it may come back down, but that's going to influence some of our crop inputs. And then interest rates are on the rise, so obviously working capital financing and capital improvement financing is also going to become more expensive. So just to finish off, I think the future to control costs in our industry is through productivity gains that we have to keep achieving, and then also to produce more value out of everything that comes off an orchard. Traditionally, we've been focused on the kernel. That's what we've been talking about here, obviously, in terms of volume and growth. But that's only 30% of what we produce in an orchard. The other 70% has not truly realized the value that I think it can. So for this industry to survive, to be profitable, to keep our costs in check, I think we need to have the whole orchard be producing more value as we go forward.
Thank you, Richard. Brenton, on the strategic investment plan, Australia identified as a major risk the constrained access to water. What is the situation in the short, medium term?
It's a very good question. Fresh water for irrigation is a valuable resource in Australia. It's a big country, but not too much fresh water. The Australian almond crop is fully irrigated, so we rely heavily on surface water or water from the river, or what we call the Murray-Darling Basin. And it's very similar to California. There's actually been no investment by a state or federal government in water storage. So what we've got is what we've got. But there has been significant investment for the large growers in Australia to build their own reservoirs on farm. So for water in Australia, it's always going to be who's got the deepest pockets to pay for the water. So water is a traded commodity and it fluctuates between various crops, and obviously almonds being a permanent crop requires ongoing irrigation. So generally in the last drought period we saw other commodities like rice and cotton trade their water out off farm to almond growers. So price will dictate where the water goes, and almonds is a high value crop, and hopefully we'll be there at the end to get the water.
Thank you, Brenton. Time to talk about global demand. Mark, reasonable prices are helping to grow global demand?
Yes, I think in terms of pricing, if you look at a historical trend for almond pricing, there tends to be a 5-year cycle. I got a great chart that goes back to the 1980s, but it tends to be a 5-year up, 5-year down, 5-year up, 5-year down cycle. But the trend line is consistently moving up over time. The highs are higher, the lows are higher. What I think we've seen in recent times is that we are seeing steady to rising prices currently in almonds, and two things drive that. One is the fact that, as I mentioned, we're seeing, despite large crops, demand more than meeting the supply. The other thing that's happening, though, in this round of increasing almond pricing is that almonds remain of value relative to other tree nuts. And that factor of almonds being not only the lowest priced tree nut, but we believe having the most versatility, the greatest flavor, and just widespread acceptability, allows almonds to continue to see a trend of gradual upward pricing that will be not only accepted by customers and consumers, but very profitable for growers around the world to continue to plant and supply almonds to meet demand. And so we would call it right now sort of a Goldilocks scenario where we have two things. One is prices are relatively stable. Even though they're rising, they're stable. And almonds remain of value relative to other tree nuts. And because of that, I think that we're in a position to handle bigger and bigger crops in terms of demand.
Thank you. The global market for dairy alternative drinks is expected to reach $16 billion in 2018, up dramatically from $7 billion in 2010. Mark, please explain us the success history of almond milk in the USA, where it already represents more than 16% of total almond sales.
Almond milk is a business that 20 years ago, Blue Diamond introduced an aseptic, shelf-stable pack of almond milk into the U.S., frankly, natural trade, and had very slow, stable growth over time. And now we have a brand at retail in the U.S. that is a $500 million brand this year at retail. And so the total U.S. market is over $1 billion in almond milk. And we continue to see that dynamic in other markets. And it's very competitive. We have markets throughout Europe where we compete against, now Danone is the owner of Silk and Alpro. But every market has multiple local competitors. And frankly, I think it's been good for the almond industry for a number of reasons. One is it consumes almonds, but you get a great big billboard that's advertising almonds and carves out a space that's frankly bigger in terms of packaging in most stores than snack nuts is. And so we have some research that suggests where there's almond milk, our snack nut business actually grows more rapidly. And so the idea of coming up with more and more things that are almond, I think, has a chance to raise demand for all categories of almond.
Thank you. The next question was for Richard, but maybe it has to be for Mark. Yeah. Are the almond yogurts the next milestone for the almond industry?
Yeah, I smiled. I knew this was a question that was coming, but I couldn't respond to it until today. So 3 weeks ago, we had our first production of almond yogurt anywhere in the world, and it very fortunately happens to be in Spain, in Galicia, that it was produced. And so I had a request this morning to see if someone wants to see Blue Diamond's new almond yogurt, I know that you can find it in Carrefour hypermarkets, but Alicampo, Leclerc, Froy's, and I may say this wrong, but Tu Dispensa is an e-commerce site that you may be able to find it. But I do think that not only almond yogurts, but other sorts of almond analogs that leverage the benefits of almond and almond protein in new forms is a real advantage, again, that we think is the next avenue for growth.
Thank you. Mark, recently Blue Diamond started marketing almond oil. Do you see an opportunity in the oil category, or it is just a strategy to value the processing byproducts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and the trend would continue with that. Clearly, almond oil for the health and beauty market, if you go into, both in Europe as well as the U.S., and I'm sure it's around the globe, almond oil as an ingredient in lotions and shampoos and other sorts of cosmetics is a clear benefit. But again, I think leveraging the protein of almond and almond oil as a healthful oil is the next big venture. And I think we only need to look at things like the soybean and seeing how that's been extrapolated into the oils and protein components, and think about, again, analogs that make sense for the almond.
Okay. Next one. Richard, maybe that's for you, because the previous was, I missed you in the previous. U.S. domestic market, a $1 billion market in a few years.
1 point what?
1 billion pounds. The domestic will achieve the 1 billion pounds market in a few years.
Yeah. So I'd just like to add a couple of comments to Mark's on the plant-based protein future of this industry. As we see it, the opportunity for this is enormous. You see what's happening with almond milk around the world. You extrapolate that further into almond cheeses, almond yogurts. Just the possibilities for taking traditional dairy but applying new technology and a lot of innovation to making these products with almond inputs is really, I think, coming into its own time. And it's not just a look-alike product that really doesn't taste very good anymore. It's really becoming something that's very acceptable. And there's some major companies, obviously Blue Diamond, but General Mills, a lot of companies getting into this space now, and I think we'll see a lot of development going forward. In terms of the U.S. market, was your question?
No, the question is U.S. domestic market. Yeah. Is possible to get a 1 billion pounds in a few years?
Yeah, I think what we've seen in the U.S., it's really astounding. I mean, we've broken records almost every month this year in domestic shipments. We've done pretty much the same with exports. But the U.S. market, I think because of the product development that we have, the incredible diversity of applications of almonds across almost every product concept, and I just mentioned a whole new area that could be a tremendous add to that, we're very fortunate with sustained growth. We really don't see, quite honestly, any market in the world, and that would include the U.S., as being mature. I think because of the really great product development that's going on and just trends in the world that fit so well, culinary trends, dietary trends that fit so well with almonds, that our future, I think, looks very good. And I just say, we talked about the growth that Antonio mentioned, that Brenton mentioned. You can see our growth that's going on. We have a lot of additional production coming on, but I believe we have the markets and the products that will be able to absorb that growth in good order.
Mark, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add some math to what Richard was saying. We've seen recent growth of 14% and 10% growth in the U.S. market over the last 2 years. If we grow at 7%, we're looking at that billion-pound market by year 4.
Thank you. Raju, will be India #1 export market for California in 2018-2019, surpassing Spain?
Thank you, Joanne. I'd like to give you a little brief history on the growth of India. India actually started importing Californian almonds way back in the 1970s, where the imports were only about 1,400 tons. And I'm proud to say that we are now at 90,000 tons from California itself. It was actually after years of hard work of the Almond Board of California and the Indian traders, stepwise removal of the trade barriers in form of licenses on imports to additional licenses. And many of you sitting in the audience would remember the historical agreement signed by Carla Hills, the USTR, for $20 million imports of almonds into India. And subsequently, the trade was liberalized to the open general license where it is right now. Simultaneously, the duties were decreased from 85% to the 10% level approximately right now. These have all led to increase in the trade every year. Now, on one hand, Spain is basically an ingredient industry, making marzipan, using flakes, standards, almond paste, etc. And they are an industrial base, distributing the products into Europe and locally consuming. On the other hand, India is only having about 10% of the consumption in the ingredient industry. And the scope is about 20 to 25% increase with the growth of the hospitality, hotel, and restaurant business over there. The balance is actually utilized in raw, soaked, overnight, festive season, confectionery, milk-based sweets, and all. I'd like to give you a little growth pattern of India over the last few years and the expected. In 2015-16, we had 69,000 tons, I beg your pardon. And last year we had 91,000 tons. This year we are expecting globally about 115,000 tons. And in the forthcoming year, if the duty structures and everything remains stable, I expect around 134,000 tons. On the other hand, Spain has been at 91,000 tons in 2015-16. Steadily increasing by about 5 to 6% per annum, and we expect this to reach about 105,000 tons in 2018-19. So India will be a leader at 134,000 tons versus Spain at 105,000 tons. An important figure that was published recently by the Almond Board of California in the year-to-date April shipment figures. India had 78,000 tons in the present year, whereas Spain was at 71,000 tons. And last year, India had 63,000 tons in the same period versus Spain at 69,000 tons. So we are already a leader in the almond shipments and the consumption now.
Raju, which are the drivers of almond consumption in India?
Joanne, India has very deep-rooted traditions. We use almonds in the religious ceremonies, the weddings, and wedding rituals. It's considered auspicious to use almonds. The festive season and the winter season accounts for about 70% of the consumption from August to January, which is also the winter season of 3 months from November to Jan. There is an immense household consumption. Almonds are considered to be very good for the brain and boost memory. The advent of snacking in India is growing by leaps and bounds, and there is a great scope for raw, roasted, salted, and flavored almonds. This is where we see a massive potential. And then in the past few years, we've seen a shift of the Indian population towards breakfast cereals, in which we see an compounded annual growth rate in 2018-21 at about 6.4%. And the total size of the market is going to be around $1,100 million US. On the other hand, the flavored almonds are growing at about 5 to 10%. There is an immense awareness of the health benefits of almonds. In a recent study done, almonds are top of the mind at 59% against other major nuts like cashews at 22%. And with much higher prices of walnuts, pistachios, and cashews, almonds are the most competitively priced nuts. And we are seeing a 10 to 15% annual growth. Though the shipments have grown by about 25% into India over the year, actually about 8 to 10% was earlier going through the LOC smuggling route of Kashmir, which has stepped down and has been brought down by the Indian government and the traders considerably. I would also like to give you some government and economy parameters. The growth of the middle class who are very health conscious. There is increase in the disposable incomes and the spending power. We have a GDP rate of 7.3%, one of the highest in the world. And the GDP of India is $2.3 trillion. reforms in our country in terms of the goods and service tax and demonetization have helped the growth of nuts. An immense population of 1.32 billion, out of which 45% of the population is under the age of 21, which is a buoyant population where we see the great scope of consumption of almonds. The growth in the retail market has been from $425 billion in 2010 to $600 billion, out of which 70% is in the food and grocery industry. By 2020, India will have 900 million people with the average age of 29 years who will be the working class. And we rank second in terms of the total food production globally. The food processing industry is also expected to grow by 100% by 2020. A major advantage we have is a vast vegetarian population, which is there in the major consuming states with highly populated states like Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Delhi, which many of you are aware of probably. A lot of people in southern and eastern part of India are also converting to vegan. That will be a healthy diet, and almonds will be consumed in that.
Okay, we are a little bit short of time. And Raju, what is the potential of the Indian market up to 5 years? What is the potential of the Indian market up to 5 years?
Well, I see the average growth of about 10 to 15% in the next 5 years. Consumption will be somewhere in the range of 200 to 250,000 tons in 5 years. However, there are certain challenges which are very important and need to be addressed. Mainly the financial crisis that is going on in India in terms of discontinuation of the LOU and buyer's credit by the Indian banks, because 50% of the almond imports are actually funded through that. There has been a little oversupply situation in the Indian market, leading to undercutting and lower prices than origin. And we need to strengthen the importers over there. The recent 2,300 million pound estimate and 179 million shipment numbers of April have strengthened our markets, and we really needed that. Over the last few months, we've seen a little dip in the Indian market, and ultimately, this will create little shortages and help the financials of the importers. A major challenge that has been there over the last few months has been the imposition of tariffs by China. And India and China being the major in-shell markets, we need to address that. However, I heard 2 days back that China issue has been resolved. We have some bad news that has been publicized over the last 2 days on India. India is proposing higher tariffs on almonds, and both sides now need to work together and try to solve this before it is actually done at the WTO level. Then lowering of the GST rates from 12 to 5%. We need to make a permanent solution by rationalization of duty structure so that we stop the smuggling over Kashmir. And reasonable and stable prices with a slightly upward trend would be helpful to boost the consumption. We need to also increase awareness in smaller states of consumption and professionalism in the industry for commerce, usage, promotion, advertising, propaganda, and educating the consumers and the industry is also the need of the hour.
Thanks, Raju. Now moving on, geopolitics, regulatory, and currency. A threat for the industry. A stronger dollar against most currency around the world make the US almonds a little bit more expensive. President Trump officially broke the Iran nuclear deal, which probably will have an impact on the Dubai and Turkish almond markets. The China trade war has increased all tariffs on almonds going into China, making them a minimum of 15% more expensive. As Raju said, last Friday, Indian government notified to the World Trade Organization that as a consequence of the steel trade war, has decided to increase all tariffs on almonds going into India, making them 10% more expensive. We are quite lucky because for walnuts the increase is 100%. We are hearing also about possible European Union retaliation measures on US almonds in response to the US tariffs on Spanish olives. Richard, it seems that you will not have a very quiet year. By a chance, do you have any good news for us? Maybe North Korea?
So this is the easiest question of the day, right, to answer? I mean, you all know what's going on in the world. I think definitely the pendulum's swinging for whatever reasons back to a more nationalistic and protectionist sort of stance of several countries in Europe, and obviously our country's going through that right now. I think that our position has always been we export 70% of our crop. We are staunch believers in free trade and certainly do not want to see unfortunate barriers being lifted in terms of tariff or non-tariff restrictions to free flow of goods. So I think we all believe that. In terms of the present conditions, I think it's a little bit difficult to project how the current sort of tit-for-tat situation is going to be resolved. Hopefully it will be, with some agreements that can come together to not escalate this any further, and hopefully to unwind what's already in place. But it's a little bit dangerous time, I think. These things can escalate so quickly, as you're seeing. And once countries take positions on these things, then you got to find diplomatic ways to unwind them. And it's a lot easier to put a tariff in place than it is to take one away. So we're hopeful, Joan, that this gets resolved between governments, and that there's some serious and sound thinking that goes on as these negotiations take place.
Thank you, Richard. Organic and sustainability. Antonio, what is the role of Spain in the organic market, and is the organic production an opportunity for the low-yield almond plantings in non-irrigated and frost-risk areas of Spain?
Thanks. Well, this is, as I said before, this is a part of the transition that is we are enjoying in Spain. No? So for the small farmers that they had a very low yield productions, the market has developed a consumption for organic almonds. This has been a big opportunity for our farmers, for our small farmers, to get a much better incomes that they didn't get in the past, or maybe trying to compete with conventional almonds. So right now in Spain, as I said before, around 85% of the total acreage or hectares is non-irrigated, but considered organic and being already certified is approximately 30% of the Spanish almond surface in Spain. So this allows us to get a production that is ready to supply the markets who are thinking that organic almonds can be a product interesting for them.
Thanks, Antonio. Richard, talking about sustainability, a challenge for the industry or an opportunity?
Well, the almond industry, unlike so many other tree nut industries, is principally grown in 3 areas of the world: in California, Australia, and here in Europe. So we have, growing areas that are sophisticated, and they're forward-looking and can be very progressive. And I believe that we have a great opportunity ahead of us to take the sustainability movement, or the sustainability practices and opportunities, to a new level for our industry that can differentiate almonds even further, I think, in the marketplace. We in California have had a sustainability program for 10 years. We keep gaining more and more participation. We just had that sustainability program benchmarked against the SAI, Sustainable Agricultural Initiative here in Europe. Our program comes in at a gold level against that program. So we have a partnership now with that organization to permit the supply chain to look at our sustainability program in a new way based on those standards. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to bring our industry even further into an advantageous position. The other is that the consumer, like it or not, I think they have insisted on more transparency with their food sourcing, and some of it's maybe some of it's is somewhat superficial, but I think the trend is there that allowing consumers to see what your industry is doing and be proud of it and promote it, I think is an opportunity as well. So we've built a great foundation in nutrition. We've built a great foundation in food safety. We have a lot of great attributes, and I think that the sustainable nature of our industry and the innovative, focus that we have on our agriculture and environmental practices can be just a great add on to the current position we have in the marketplace for almonds.
Thanks. Now we will open the round table to all the questions from the audience, questions that will be channeled through the APP and displayed on the screen. First question for Mark. How late will the California crop be, and what will that do to the market considering the low volume carry out? How long will it take to fill the pipeline after record consumption this year?
The California, there we go. When you think about the California crop this year, we had such an unusual pattern. We had record warm temperatures in January, so we saw one of the earliest starts of bloom that California has seen, which would indicate, hey, this is going to be an earlier crop, likely. But then, because of the cold temperatures, we saw the most long and drawn-out bloom that we've seen in recent history. And because of that, it feels like the crop may be a little bit later. I would say that it's too early to give a strong, certain answer to that. We may be a week or so later than a year ago. The fact remains is that likely we'll certainly get in. Obviously, the nonpareils will start coming in sometime in mid-August, and then they have to be processed and sold. And so it will be until likely September that we see any meaningful supply of that. And as typical, the pollinizers follow later, and so it will likely be October before we see any meaningful supply available on the pollinizer side. The fact remains that it's not so much the timing of the crop is going to be that there is just going to be shortages this summer on certain varieties of California almonds because there won't be enough good quality product left. That I go back to that carryout number is not only low, but it's a situation where that which is carried out in some cases may be the lower quality product that is the last to be processed by most handlers.
Thank you. For Richard. Good morning. The good reputation is more difficult to build and very easy to lose. What kind of measures are you applying from Almond Board of California? I imagine this question is Richard, maybe Richard. See, the question is, the good reputation is more difficult to build and very easy to lose. What kind of measures are you applying from Almond Board of California? I think it's related with all the hash market and everything, I imagine.
I think if that's what it's referring to, I think we have done a great job of providing a high quality food safe product. There is in Europe incoming a certain amount of quantity of lower grade product that we at the Almond Board, together with our industry, are studying to see how we can make sure that the world trade is dealing with the adequate quality of product that we'd like to see distributed around the world. I think we all have a vested interest in this. This is the future of the industry and our businesses to make sure that the gains that we've achieved over many years, we're not going to be in a position to lose some of those gains because of certain industry practices. So we have task forces and our board of directors very aware of this situation that I think you're mentioning, John, of the hash coming into this market, and we'll be taking further initiatives in the coming months about that.
Thanks. Another question for you, Richard. With all the new selection technologies being present in the market and the increased demand for good quality products, could you inform us on the developments with regards to the USDA specifications which seem outdated on several parameters such foreign material and chip and scratch?
Well, I think this is an age-old question of the grades that we have in California or in the USDA. Obviously, those grades have been established for many years, and that's formed the basis for most of the business that's done, although buyers and sellers do obviously contract based on different grades than the USDA establishes. I think we encourage you to always approach the Almond Board with your concerns about those grades and any suggestions you have about improving them. It's not something that is done, overnight to try and change something like that, but we're always interested in knowing how industry feels that those can be improved.
Okay, and the last question. Given that, Mark, maybe for you, given the tremendous growth of demand in the past few years for almonds, what is the panel's view on sustaining the growth rate in the coming years, and what factors could impede this growth other than response to higher price?
Yeah, first of all, I think obviously price is one of the critical factors in making sure that almonds remain of value. Beyond that, clearly one of the areas that we're all watching are areas that create any sort of uncertainty. And trade is that area, and tariffs in particular. If I could offer some encouragement in that space, it would be this, that what we know about our U.S. president is he really likes to do two things. One is he likes to create chaos, sometimes daily on Twitter, and two, he likes to create deals. And so with those two things, I think this is part of his strategy, part of his game plan. And we have an election in the U.S. coming up this fall, and it'll be a tightly contested race for both our House and our Senate. And he needs to have as many positive wins in place to ensure that Republicans maintain control. And so I would say by the end of summer, there will be a high drive or a high push for U.S. to resolve as many of these outstanding questions as possible. And if we can do that, and it looks like there's progress already on China, and hopefully India with Modi's and Trump's friendly relationship, that can be resolved. I think those are the biggest areas of uncertainty that I would like to see taken care of before we get that new crop coming in and shipping. That's the only major derailer that I see in the near term.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Mark, does your estimate of 2.36 billion include contribution from third leaf acreage? And what do you think third leaf production will actually be in the 2018 crop?
Yeah, I think I heard most of this, but it was...
Does it include what? Sorry.
What? Repeat. Does your estimate of 2.36 billion pounds include contribution from third leaf acreage?
Oh, third leaf acreage.
Yeah, and that's an interesting and an appropriate question in that typically the way the USDA looks at it and as we look at it is the bearing acres are at least 3 years old. But what we're seeing with self-fertile varieties, and I think this is true around the world, but also in the U.S., is that many of those self-fertile varieties produce 1,000-pound crops at second leaf. And so those numbers tend to get rolled into the yield estimates overall because we receive the crop even though we're not counting the acreage. So you could argue that our yields are likely a bit inflated because of that. And that phenomenon will be consistent from one year to the next. Where it can have an impact is that we're seeing an increasing proportion of self-fertile varieties. And so I think that sort of impact of young, second leaf trees providing meaningful volume will continue to increase.
Thank you. We are out of time and we have to put an end to the Almond Roundtable. Thank you very much to all the panelists and thank you very much to the audience for your participation. I wish you a good and profitable almond season.